Welcome everybody and everyone at home. We've got a really interesting session today. What I'm going to do shortly is introduce a colleague of mine called Blair Sheppard, who's on our global board at PwC. He's in charge of our global strategy and leadership for the network across our 169 countries and 285,000 staff. Now, Blair's just published a book you can see here called 10 Years to Midnight, which is a fascinating read. So the session is going to be in a couple of parts. We're going to have a video interview with Blair that's pre-recorded last week, which I think you'll find really, really fascinating, around the 4 crises affecting the world and the impact that technology will have and how it can be the solution of this problem as well. I'm going to jump back on stage after about 20 minutes and bring it down a level to talk about the work that I'm doing in this country around artificial intelligence, with a particular flavor around well-being in the corporate environment, and I'll be around for questions afterwards as well. So if we could just ask you to play the video first, and I'll be back with you in about 20 minutes after we've seen what Blair has to say. Thank you. Welcome back to Digital DNA. I'm Rob McCargow, PwC's Director of Artificial Intelligence, and it's my huge pleasure to be joining this terrific event, both virtually and in person in Belfast. In today's discussion, we're going to be exploring the multifaceted global crises facing businesses and society at large in the coming years, and how technology is playing a contributing role in exacerbating these crises. However, more optimistically, we will then be identifying how technology can provide us with some of the solutions that we now urgently require. To guide us through this extraordinarily complicated set of intertwined issues and interdependencies, I'm joined by somebody I feel is ideally qualified for the job at hand. Blair Sheppard is the global leader for strategy and leadership at PwC. He is also Professor Emeritus and Dean Emeritus of Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. And during his time at Duke, he was the founding CEO and chairman of Duke Corporate Education and was a principal force behind opening Duke's campus in Kunshan, China, which I've had the privilege to visit 3 years ago. Blair's advised over 100 companies and governments in the areas of leadership, corporate strategy, organizational relationships and design, and has published more than 50 books and articles, including his latest book, 10 Years to Midnight, which I can highly recommend. Blair, welcome to Digital DNA.
Thanks, Rob. I'm thrilled to be here.
So, Blair, you've spent the last 9 years or so with PwC working with leadership teams, both for our firm and with our clients across the globe. And this has seen you form a really clear and compelling view of what business leaders are now facing up to in 2021. To begin with, in your view, what are the main crises that you feel are the most urgent ones to address in the decade ahead?
So we clearly have to recover from the events of the last year and a half, right? But if you think about what was going on before then and what that accentuated, there are sort of 4 more profound issues we need to address, right? So the first one is actually the sort of growing sense in many people in the world that the future just doesn't look very attractive for them. They feel like they're not benefiting from society. They're caused by largely the disparities that are occurring in the world. And when a lot of the people, be they young, be they mid-career, be they about to retire, think that the future doesn't look very good, they stop trying, right? They stop creating this, and they start debating how much of the pie is mine versus creating the pie, right? And so we call it crisis of prosperity. The second one is one that's directly related to the group we're having conversation with, which is the sort of crisis of technology. And there are these 2 technologies: the industrial technology system, how we grow food, move things, build things, and the information technology system. And both of them have unintended consequences that are really quite severe for society. In one case, it's existential, which is, can we survive the planet? In the other case, it's actually institutional in a way. The third crisis is resulting from those first 2, which is that people have lost trust in institutions. And that's a problem. It's sort of like a fish not trusting water. If I don't believe that the banking system and the education system and government and the tax system that work, then actually I don't know how to conduct my life. And that's getting more severe every year. And then the final one is actually kind of a byproduct of those 3, which is we don't have the leaders we need to help us navigate these 4 crises, these other crises. And that may be the biggest one, because without the leadership, we won't get them solved. Rob, we only have 10 years. This is a really important point. These are these are things that feel like they've been around for a while and are going to be here for a long time. But actually, the thing everyone needs to understand is we have a decade to address them or we're really in trouble.
I mean, 2030 is the sort of target day set out in the book, and it's a nice round number. But can you just elaborate further about why specifically these different crises are culminating in that being the sort of the key deadline and milestone to solve by?
Let me do the easy one, climate, and then generalize it, right? So in some sense, what we're seeing is an acceleration of kind of the feedback loops in the system. So forests are burning faster than we predict they would. The coral is bleaching faster than we predicted it would. The plankton in the northern and southern oceans are dying faster than we thought they would. So it turns out those three things represent the Earth's lungs. They're the ones that take CO2 out of the atmosphere. At the same time, northern Canada and northern Russia are actually getting warmer faster than anywhere else in the world, and so their peat moss is thawing out. The problem is that peat is the world's methane sink. So we're pumping methane into the atmosphere at the same time we're not able to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Problem with methane is it's 110 times more efficient than CO2 at capturing heat. So we're building this thing that's capturing the heat, and we're not able to take it out. And the issue is, in a decade, if we don't get ahead of that, some things will happen to become irreversible. We'll get current changes. We'll get forests never growing back. We'll get food unable to be grown. And once you've lost it, you've lost it. And so the issue is, we have a decade before things get irreversible in certain circumstances. And Rob, think about this. We're talking about a massive change in the entire industrial technology platform in the world. In order to get that to happen, that's a non-trivial change problem. So if you take IT, AI becomes really dominant within a decade, and it's much harder to change it once it's embedded in an AI system. Institutions, our trust in institutions is accelerating. Distrust is accelerating. We're now down to 18% of the world's population thinking that institutions are working for them. And the growing disparity hits home. So retirees will retire, the kids will be in work, and the job shifts will occur. So it all kind of comes to a head in a decade, and we've got to deal with it now, or then it's a much tougher problem.
Now, hey, we're at a conference looking at all things technology, business, innovation, and skills, and many other sort of obviously correlated types of factors. Help me here, Blair. I mean, you've spoken about some mega trends that I think many people in the room today and online are going to be well aware of. But I'm struggling to grasp why tech is the culprit that influences all of these crises in your vision.
Well, it's entirely the culprit in a sense. So let's think of it. So let's take the crisis of prosperity, which is really arising from asymmetry in the world, right? The challenge with platform technology, which is the way we're conducting the economy today, is it creates a winner-take-all outcome, right? And that accrues for two reasons. One of them is that actually platforms only work if they have many, many, many people on them, and they have lots of things happening over them. So a few platforms dominate the world. But the other one is that because it's transparent everywhere in the world and I can pick whatever I want, small differences matter. And so one thing that's slightly better than the rest just takes off and dominates, right? That's a world where asymmetry occurs. You have a lot of wealth in one city, a lot of wealth in a few people's hands, a lot of wealth in, and so the rest are left behind. That's the first piece. If you take the crisis of technology itself, you know, the founders of social media did not intend to sort of create massive polarization and massive loss of trust in institutions, but they did. Right? And it's a consequence of it. They didn't mean to sort of make teenagers more anxious and more depressed, and therefore increase suicide rates and increase self-harm. But they did, right? They didn't mean to actually cause significant job loss in places where people have to sort of completely rethink what it is to have a career. But they did, right? And so, in a sense, the direct consequences of technology are real, right? And if you take the institutional trust question, think of it in the following way. How many aspects of government would be better done by a platform? So simple one, the little trivial one is, just think about sort of all the data we gather on citizenry to sort of then plan what we're going to do in the future, right? You know, it was done back in England in the original time with a book that went around and they got information. It took 10 years to gather all that information. Turns out I could do it overnight if I could access the data in Google. Right. So why are we creating that information at a national level, taking months and lots of human effort when we can actually have it available immediately? So what's happening is the capability of the institutions to keep up with the pace of change that's driven by technology is not there. So we're not educating as well as we need to. We're not providing information at the speed we need to. And this is the paradox. Institutions are trusted because they're slow to change, but technology is forcing them to change fast and they can't catch up. And if you take the leadership piece, well, we'll talk about that later, but I think the important point is we need a different kind of leader. And if we don't have it, we will not be able to respond to any of those issues. So technology is right in the bullseye of all three of these crises.
And the way that business takes a lead in this, I know you're a strong believer of the positive effects that big business can have upon these crises. In terms of the trust equation, are you seeing this deterioration afflicting business as well as government institutions and all stakeholders, or is it a uniquely focused upon one part of the sector?
It's really interesting. The only thing that's not distrusted is the firm I work for. Everything else trust is declining. Right. So here's the thing, right? So the people on this call who are business people, you're the only game left. This is a really important thing for us to interpret, right? As citizens, we care a lot about the crises I just described, and we would say, let's let the government take care of it or civil society take care of it. The population doesn't trust government and doesn't trust civil society. The only thing they trust is the business they work for. So we are in a position where we have no choice but to take a lead in dealing with these issues.
So we've just launched our new global strategy, the new equation, of which you are the key author of. And long story short, this is seeing us as an organization investing many billions of dollars in the years ahead, with a particular emphasis upon ESG and technology. So again, to expand further on this sort of direction of the conversation, there's a huge amount business can do to sort of turn this corner and to start resolving the crises, but it feels quite hopeless at the moment. 2030 now is less than a decade away. What can the people in the room do? What are the solutions? How do we remain optimistic that this corner can be turned? And what do we do next?
Yeah, let's think about that with three lenses in mind. One of them is, how do we do things massively and fast, right? Because essentially what I described is we've got a change problem that's way bigger than we'd take centuries to do it historically. We got to do them in a decade. Turns out without technology and without platform technology, we could never do things massively and quickly. Just think about how fast we're able to model the gene and create a way of targeting the virus gene. That would have taken 20 years, even a year ago, right? And so we have the ability to get to scale quickly and implement problems quickly because technology exists. That's one reason why I think technology is kind of the savior. Even though it's the culprit, it's also the angel in this story, right? The second piece is actually a lot of the answers are going to require integration of Internet of Things, analytics, and sort of sector-specific technology capability to sort of take things on. So how do we do farming way better and way more adaptive to the environment? Massive technology question. How do we do transportation? Massive technology question. How do you do energy? Massive technology question, right? And so in a sense, IT is the thing that will help us transform those businesses quickly. And then it's just sort of say, how do we get people to know the solutions they need to adapt, change our lifestyle? How do we get people to think about investing differently? How do you deal with the kind of information requirement to pull all this off? Again, that's best done through technology. So technologists in the world have a choice. They can either be the devil or the angel. Right? They can continue to pursue what we're doing as a technology strategy and take us down a very, very dark hole, or they can actually use technology to create the answers, communicate the answers, and implement them at scale quickly, and therefore become the angel. And I think that this audience that we're speaking to is at the heart of that choice, and I hope we make the right one.
Yeah, indeed. The challenge that I think at system level we've faced when we've tried to do massive and fast in the past is that there's not an innate level of collaboration and coordination between competing entities or geopolitical entities and the rest of that. What gives you faith that that level of collaboration will be able to take root to do massive and fast this time round, though?
So there's this really interesting emergent literature on when do people collaborate, right? So let's go back to the original study of this, where they created a camp and they put kids in shirts with different colors, right? And they called them different names. They had them compete with each other. And what ended up happening was massive conflict. They actually had people beating each other up on the way to cabin at night, right? As a consequence. I said, so how do we solve this problem? Well, what they did, it was really clever. So they had the food truck break down 2 miles outside of camp. And they said, we're not going to eat unless we all go get the food together, right? And so they ended up creating a shared problem that was obviously important to all of us, right? Now, the good news in climate, by the way, and the good news in a couple of the other crises I described is every one of us is being harmed, and we're seeing the harms accelerate. And so in some ways, the consequences of the crisis I described are becoming more and more apparent to every one of us. And so we have a massive shared problem. I think the opportunity available to us is to say, let's pick one or two of those that we all can agree on, and let's really take it on and then use that to coattail the rest. So if we're worried about how do we create a more balanced distribution of wealth, let's use solving climate as a way to do that, right? Because it's going to be hard to debate the wealth distribution problem in its own right. You just see that splitting countries apart. But if we can agree on one or two things that really matter, and focus on those, we can coattail the rest. The question, Rob, is does that happen fast enough? If we have a decade, we have kind of 6 months to a year for us to organize ourselves around one or two things we can all agree on all over the world. And I think nature's coming pretty fast and making us feel that way. I just hope she comes. There's this odd thing. I want her to do lots of destruction so we wake up and say, boy, we got a problem on our hands. But I don't want her to do lots of destruction. So that's the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. You've always struck me as a pragmatic optimist, though, Blair, willing to address some of the challenges, but solution focused as well. And I think it's evident from our work together around the technology field in the last 5 years that many of the problems that are at the root cause of issues and harm perpetuated by technology are often human factors, aren't they? I think it's clear that humanity at the heart of technology is one of the principal factors, for better or for worse, whether it's press stories of tech leading to discrimination or poor outcomes or regulatory sanction. I think there's clearly a massive opportunity around talent, around business leadership, and how do you equip the people with those skills, tools, outlooks, beliefs, and level of purpose to tackle that extraordinarily interconnected set of problems and crises. So one of the things I know that you did over the last few years is get around all of our territories, just about globally. You've interviewed all manner of people across the organization and clients, and you'd come across quite a number of observations about some of these issues that leaders now are facing. Could you maybe just expound upon that slightly?
Yeah, there's a lot in that, but let me emphasize two. One of them is that in order to solve these problems, we have to be able to do things that feel mutually contradictory. Right, we've got to be able to reconcile the paradox implied in this. So an example is, how do we protect the traditions of institutions, but innovate massively in those institutions, right? How do we deal with all the politics of the change I just described, but retain our integrity? The one that's particularly important to this technology discussion is, how do we understand humanity, human systems, psychology, but also have a deep awareness of technology? And think about it in a sense. I used to be at a university. I was at Duke for a long time. It turns out our engineers didn't take the social sciences and our social scientists didn't take engineering. That's a problem, because we actually need people who understand both sides of, they really get technology and are current in technology, but also really understand how people work, how human systems work, how society and how politics work. If you think about many of the unintended consequences of technology systems, it's kind of the naive psychology of the founders of the business. They thought they were improving democracy and improving collaboration. They never anticipated that they would have the consequence they had. They thought, right? And so we need people who are sophisticated on both sides of that deal, that are really good with humanity and really good with technology. And I bet everyone in this room is good at one and not the other. And so go figure out how to be good at the other one, right? To me, the most important piece. The second one is, let's agree on the few things we're going to tackle and really put massive capital and energy and resource behind it and get it done. Um, and if we focused on those two things, we had a sense of purpose, and we had the ability to sort of do things that feel at odds with each other. I'm pretty optimistic. If we don't have a sense of purpose and we stay in our silos, I get really, really worried.
Yeah, sure. Just to sort of bring things to a conclusion with some practical takeaways, I'm mindful that we've got a fairly hefty might to mobilise our 284,000 people globally towards this common purpose. But we've got the benefit of colleagues in the room in Belfast and online today in the conference coming from all manner of different organisations, sectors and scale of businesses. When it comes to that talent piece in particular, what's the blueprint to success? What people are you looking for? What do you need to see in your leadership team in a much more tangible way to, I think, equip you to contribute to this push?
So three things really quickly. The first is everyone needs to understand that they're part of the solution. And so we all need to step up, right? So one of the challenges we have in a traditional hierarchical firm, it feels like unless the CEO tells me I can't do it, right? And I don't feel like I have a leadership responsibility. There are so many pieces to the things I described. Every one of us owns a piece. So step up and grab the piece is the first thing, right? Second one is be really self-aware of the things that you're not good at and either build it in yourself or hire it. So I think we're going to find is we need teams to solve these issues or collaborations to solve these issues. And you've got to collaborate with people who are not you. A lot of us like to hire mini-me's. A lot of us like to surround ourselves with people who think like us, talk like us, act like us. It's a really bad idea in the world I just described because you need the person who's not you, who has the strengths you don't have. And then the final one in that is you have to respect that. So this is an interesting thing. The reason we tend not to be good at something is because we don't like it. If we liked it, we'd be good at it. Right? We'd spend time on it. So you actually have to learn to love the thing you hate, which is a hard thing for people to do, right? Because I'm basically saying to an engineer, you like tangible problems and get a solution to. Now go understand all the ambiguity that human systems entail. Drives them crazy. You go talk to a social scientist and say, you like muddling in human beings and ambiguity. Go figure out what technology is really doing. Because in the first case, if you don't understand technology, you're irrelevant in the future. And if you don't understand human systems, you're going to cause harm. And so we need people who can do both. But more important than that, we need people who can bring others together in a collaborative manner to do both. Because PwC can't, you talked about our 284,000 people. There's no way we can do this as PwC. We're one small pebble in a very big pond. And the pond has to come together and work together. So cross boundaries and take it on.
Just a final question. You'll have watched with interest how Northern Ireland and Belfast in recent years has become a real gem in the technology ecosystem, extraordinary talent, terrific integration with the universities and major businesses moving in all the time. You've met government ministers around the world. You've looked at upskilling challenges and strategies and policies. And I think many of the previous way of thinking is a bit debunked. We can't necessarily forecast what jobs will be looking like in 5-10 years' time. Is there a sort of a master plan that you would say that businesses in Northern Ireland in particular need to think about in order to retain competitive advantage, ensure that they are working harmoniously with business, educators and the government and other stakeholders? And where have you seen this work well on your travels, when you were traveling, of course?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm traveling electronically, so I get to see it kind of two dimensions now, not multiple dimensions, but in only one sense. But so let's do the individual and then the society for a minute, right? If you think about what you're trying to create for individuals, the optimal job, in a way, is a really interesting piece of work that matters, you get paid well for, but is creating forward-looking skills and then provides a platform to the next opportunity. So part of the job of organizations is to help people live their life in chapters. I used to live my life as a vector. I was an assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, assistant dean, associate dean, dean, and then I went to work the ultimate job, PwC, right? And it turns out that's not the way life is going to work in the future. It's going to be chapter to chapter to chapter. And the chapters are going to be different, sometimes flowing outside an organization back into the organization. So think about organizing in a way that allows people to have a chapter that's good and then move on to the next chapter. The second thing is at a societal level. What's nice about Northern Ireland is not just it's a technology hub, but it's of a scale where you can get your arms around things, right? The problems that I'm describing are systemic. A place like China will never address it at a systemic level because it's too big. A place like the US won't. But Northern Ireland has the ability as a community of government, civil society, read university, and business to say, let's learn how to do these systematic things together and say, we know we have to manage the transportation system at the same time, the real estate system at the same time, the work system at the same time, and work them collectively. So what I'd advise the universities is don't just turn out technologists, turn out problem solvers who understand how the whole system works. What I say to business is learn to collaborate with each other to build Northern Ireland as kind of the exemplar of what the world could look like if we did it right. Right. And you kind of see that happening in places like Estonia. You see that happening in places like New Zealand. What's interesting about all those places is they're of a scale where you can do it together as a community. And I think that's one of the great things about Northern Ireland is that it's a community, right? With its challenges, as we all have, but you can get it to happen in a systematic manner in a way that could be really, really impressive and lead the world.
Blair, thank you. I think that time is up. I would just like to thank you for the wisdom, for the accessible thinking around how we tackle some of these global challenges and crises, and hopefully a positive and pragmatically optimistic blueprint for the future. And I sincerely hope we can also encourage you to physically come across to Belfast for Digital DNA 2022.
I would love to be there, and thanks for having me. It's an honor. And by the way, as you asked me earlier, Rob, my family large part hails from Ireland and Northern Ireland. So any way I can help my ancestors, I'm happy to do it.
Fantastic. Listen, thanks very much for your time. It's been a real privilege to delve into that mind of yours. And if you want to follow Blair, I'd highly recommend following him on social media. He's great on Twitter, but in particular, check out his book, 10 Years to Midnight. Blair Sheppard, thank you. I've been Rob McCargow, and back to Digital DNA. Thank you.
Okay, fascinating guy. Really enjoyed speaking to Blair, and hopefully we can get him back in person next year. What I wanted to do today was just bring it down a level and get a bit deeper into technology over the next 10 minutes or so, and expand further in terms of the more practical solutions we can start to bring to bear to tackle some of these crises. Blair, obviously, in his talk, spoke about these 5 main issues that are driving the disruption across the asymmetry, disruption we're seeing driven by technology, the issue around the age demographics affecting us, polarization, and at the heart of this trust issue that is becoming a real particular problem between society and business and the government around the world. He then spoke about the 4 crises afflicting the world, and you saw here prosperity, institutional legitimacy, and leadership. But at the heart of this crisis is a crisis of technology. And I think what we talk about with technology, you've heard these talks before, there's major issues around the impact on the world of work due to job automation. We know that technology, even this week, many stories abounding around things like the impacts on mental health of teenagers with social media. And AI, in my particular domain, is well known now that if it's not harnessed well, if AI is not harnessed responsibly, if you're not building the right level of governance, trust, and ethical conduct into the approach of how you harness it, it is now leading to real-world harm. So we have this extraordinarily complicated and multifaceted set of challenges to overcome to ameliorate the effects of the crisis of technology. But as we heard in Blair's talk as well, there is genuinely an opportunity to harness this as a social good, to take the issue of technology being the culprit in this crisis to being the solution. And some of the principles here that Blair set out in his book I thought were worth just mentioning here around we cannot control what we do not understand, increasingly thinking about information as both a public and a private good, making sure that the interplay between organizations' agendas and society at large have to be very clearly understood, the essential requirement to govern things we cannot see, and finally understanding the critical determinant between positive and negative consequences to ensure that we hold technology to account. So lots and lots of good promise here, but it requires a sort of a multi-set of stakeholders coming together to solve it. One of the things that's hot off the press, which I'd urge you to look at, was literally last week, the UK government has announced a new national AI strategy. You can check it out on the BEIS or the DCMS website, but there is some quite good promise here. And the overall ambition here, quote, to remain an AI and science superpower fit for the next decade, that often puts some of these things like talent and ethics and governance at the heart. So there is some quite exciting developments to come around the overall UK approach to it. What I wanted just to spend a few minutes talking to is how this collides with the world of work. And I think this has been a fascinating insight in the last 18 months or so. Every day there's a new story about the effects of technology and the pandemic. One of the surveys that we did was really interesting. We surveyed 32,500 workers around the world a few months ago. And some of the findings are absolutely astonishing. So I just wanted to pick out some of the more high-profile ones. Only 9% of those who can work remotely want to go back full-time. 72% prefer this sort of mixture we're calling hybrid working. And an astonishing 19% of people don't want to go back to the office ever again. So this sort of profound seismic shift in the world of work is really interesting for business leaders to contend with. Well, the other thing that's happening, though, is that change is happening, but it's accelerating. I was interested in the colleague from McDonald's this morning, seeing what they've achieved in the last year and a half in totally pivoting their business model digitally in the last 18 months or so. And the way that we're interacting with ourselves, with the workplace at large, is happening faster than ever before. And we're hearing organizations doing things in 6 months that were 6 years down the roadmap in the future. Naturally, though, there is this degree of uncertainty and anxiety in our workforces, and the same survey I mentioned before had a couple of findings which we should maybe think about. 60% of people remain worried about automation putting their jobs at risk. We know that 39% of people think their jobs are obsolete within 5 years. That's not long to go. But there is huge ambition and belief that people can retrain, upskill, and reposition themselves for the future. But at the heart of this is this sort of well-being consideration that I think now is evident and has gained a lot more traction over the course of the last year and a half. And if it's taken a crisis to raise it to the agenda, then so be it. Let's see what we can do about it. I think what we're now moving into is this different way of working. You know, we've had this virtual age in the last year, moving towards this level of personalization in the way we're going forward to a genuinely intelligent way, that the way we consume work in the future with well-being at the heart. So what I wanted to do today was just very, very briefly come back to the digital DNA to talk about an experiment that we conducted over the last year and a half, which had some fascinating insights. So what we did is we partnered with a team of people coming out of Formula One, who had a particular focus around elite human performance. And we recruited 1,000 volunteers in our UK workforce to join us for a really interesting pilot where we had them wearing wearables, Garmin's, measuring biometric data from heart rate variability, stress, sleep, rest, recovery. We'd psychometrically baselined everybody, and then every day we did cognitive function testing to understand the effects of things like their workload on their ability to switch tasks and memorize patterns, etc. And then accessed hours worked, how busy their diaries were they doing 45 Zoom calls back-to-back over the course of the week, which most of us have been trying to survive over the last year and a half. And I just wanted to sort of discover what we discovered and talk about where this might go in the future to see technology genuinely adding value to our lives as workers. So I think the first thing we did was we measured the stress of our people in 2019 compared to 2020. And one of the things we noticed here, you can see, is that we were 20% more stressed in 2020 compared to 2019. I think that would resonate with everyone here. One of the interesting things was that we were 27% less active. And I don't know if anyone's, my first time I've been in public in about a year and a half trying to fit into the suit. I think that's definitely something I've noticed for, you have to laugh, seriously. So we know that we are more stressed and less active. Now this is the one that really caught the attention of our leadership team at PwC. So what you can see here is the green trace are the perceived level of stress. We asked every one of those 1,000 people every day, how stressed do you feel today? And they gave it a score. The red trace is their actual biometric stress. And this is off the heart rate variability from the Garmin to show the differences between their perceived level of stress and their actual biometric stress. So you can see on the graph here, first of all, there's an awful correlation between the two. So people in the main were saying that they were more stressed than they actually were, apart from when we looked at these two massive spikes. I'm saying, what the hell was this? Well, we looked at this from all sorts of angles. Was it announcements in the press? Was it things happening externally? Was it things happening internally within the organization? And we worked out that this is our performance management cycle doing this. So this was the point of the year when we were having conversations with our managers to talk about their performance. And this is not the people receiving the message. The people giving the message were also seeing elevated stress. So not only were we 20% more stressed, we were then spiking over the two key parts of our performance cycle. So inadvertently, we were making the staff more stressed by talking about performance, which wasn't exactly what we wanted to do. I'll come back to that in a moment. The other thing we noticed was that there was a radical difference in environmental factors affecting the staff's wellness. And I know we've got into this habit, haven't we, of thinking of all workers as sort of singular units of labor. And we've now bit by bit moved along to thinking about workers as different personas with certain different traits. We're now able to get into a really granular level of micro personas to understand the particular features of their lives at home, at work, and cater for it accordingly. What you can see here is the thing I've circled is this is the part of the cohort who had no home office working remotely and who also did have homeschooling responsibilities, saw a profound drop in sleep compared to the rest of our colleagues. So we're already getting into this situation where we can't treat everyone equally because everyone's got very different features in their home life. This is just a small snapshot of some of the findings that we discovered. The other thing was that on the left-hand side here, you can see that this is the amount of activity by age. So our youngest staff, our graduate intake, and our school leavers on the left were profoundly less active than the old people in the workforce, including myself. Exactly. In some cases, people were doing less than 1,000 steps a day, literally rolling out of bed, answering the door, going to the laptop, making a coffee, going back to bed. You know, that's literally the level of lack of activity we had. So we could see that there was this issue building up around the younger generation as well. What we're now able to do is effectively quantify well-being. We can take all those different features from the biometric trace, from the cognitive functioning of our staff, and the environmental factors they're experiencing at home, and then link that through to context. How many hours you're working, what you're doing, how busy your diary is, and other features, and actually create a real-time well-being metric so we can now go ahead by business unit and look in real time as management what's happening to our staff. But critically, this is my data, highly aggregate and anonymize that data and give each member of staff their own dashboard of exactly what's happening in their work life. And this is my data. You can see here that I did actually get into running last year. You wouldn't necessarily know it now. I've had a busy summer eating. But you can see that my step count is through the roof compared to the rest of the cohort. You can see that I've got woeful pattern memory against my colleagues, which I've been told that as an AI practitioner isn't optimal at all. But I've got quite a good response inhibition and task switching. But what I can do is I can basically dive into specific day, work out what was happening to me that day that saw my concentration crater and my stress increase, and look at the features of that day and understand, was it hours worked, was it the type of project I was working on, were 9 back-to-back Zoom calls leading to a deterioration in my performance and well-being. And that way we can start linking through to things like employee assistance programs. The problem we've had in the last year is well-being's become trendy, and we've thrown the kitchen sink at it. So we gave all of our staff a Headspace app, whether they wanted it or not, and that wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. So I think what we're now getting to the point of doing in the future is equipping people with genuinely useful insight around what's happening to their working style, and effectively the tailor the work accordingly to what they need to enhance their well-being and in turn lead to better performance and productivity. So many of you will have seen we've announced this new policy at work where we're now giving people more of flexibility around where they're working, how many days they're working. We've also trialled a 4.5-day working week over the summer. But the problem is that whilst hybrid work sounds great and it's well-intentioned and it could lead to an amazing amount of breakthroughs to liberate different parts of your workforce, to increase well-being, to make us more productive, lots and lots of hoped-for upside. The problem is, if you walk into this blind with outdated tools, with poor baseline data, there is a real, genuine risk that this leads to unintended consequences and could exacerbate inequality. It can lead to a deterioration in well-being and health and fitness. And I think if we are not able to do this in a way that provides us real-time understanding of exactly what's happening in our workforce, we're too late in the day. You know, we're relying on things like employee pulse survey data, which anyone in the room will tell you they don't like filling in. They're forced to at the end of the month. It's never able to be acted upon quickly enough to do much about it. If you can invert that around and provide real-time insight, it's a much more powerful thing to do. So just to sort of connect the dots here, to sort of link it through to the overall crisis of technology becoming a solution of technology, I think some of the takeaways I've had from running this project for the last year or so has been a few things as follows. There was a real risk that when the shutters came down last year, we switched off the tap. And this could have been the worst thing we could have done. It was vital for us to maintain investment, innovation, right at when times were tough. One of the things that you don't do with this sort of technology is walk in blind and do it to the workforce. It was so critical that we did this in collaboration with and coordination with our staff. So I sit on our People Council. We've done a huge amount of collaboration and designed it with the staff at the heart. It has to be voluntary. It has to be entirely transparent about what we're doing with data, and it has to be ethically sound. I've got a full-time ethicist in my team looking at all these different unintended consequences. One of the things we have to also do is ensure there's a two-way value exchange. We have to demonstrate that it's of value to the individual, and then through that process of anonymization and aggregation, we get that level of value for management to take action accordingly. And one of the things we also did is recruited several members of our board to take part, including our chairman, Kevin Ellis. He was strapped up as one of my guinea pigs as well. One of the things, though, I think about technology where it's gone wrong, you see it in the press every week where it's led to a car crash. It's often because it's been technology first. And I think one thing we did was try to get the governance right, get robust science right at the heart of the project, and pull the team together, interdisciplinary team, different skills across the firm and external, then apply the technology. And finally, to realize that too many of these tools at the moment are trying to squeeze more productivity and performance out of an already depleted workforce. And our view is that we have to turn that around on its head. Get well-being right, liberate your staff, empower them, give them that level of insight they've not seen before, and performance and productivity follows as a byproduct, as a natural reaction to it. So I've reached the end of that. I would say that Blair's book, talking about some of these themes at a high level, is fantastic. It's very accessible. It's called 10 Years to Midnight. I'd recommend it from any good local bookstore. If you want to hang around, I'd be very happy to have a chat about either Blair's big vision or some of the more specific technology interventions we've done here at PwC. So I'll be around here and at our stand for the rest of the afternoon. So unless anyone's got any questions, thanks very much for listening. It's been great to be at Digital DNA in person, and I look forward to coming back with Blair next year in person. Thanks for your time.
Rob. So, Rob, don't leave. I want you to stay here. We've got about 10, 15 minutes anyway.
Okay, cool.
So, if that's okay with you, I would love to know if anyone's got any questions in the audience. Yes. Don't hold that.
No, wait. Jeanette Sherman from Ulster University, and one of my key responsibilities is leadership development. Yeah. So those front-end slides are really important. Are they in the public domain? Is there a report, or is it in that link?
I think we're going to have this session on demand. So I think we'll be able to access the session, but we can exchange details afterwards, and I can share with you some of the findings if you want.
Okay.
Very happy. Yeah, indeed.
Really good question. Okay, the gentleman... Oh, sorry. Was there someone else? No. Yep. I'm going to run down there. Okay. This is... I've always wanted to do this. Oh, happy days.
We should get you on Garmin for the step count.
Right.
It's okay. Yeah, I can speak quite loud. Great presentation. My overall interest is, how do you feel about the hybrid work environment? Can you see you recommending people to work in an independent hot desk facility part of the week at home, and part of the week in headquarters, or doesn't that work?
Well, we have making quite a conscious decision at our place, PwC, to give some guardrails around this. And this was interesting. We did survey the staff. I think actually the way it worked was that the older staff were quite happy with this new life at home, with a day in the office here and there. It was our younger staff into the workforce wanting that access to learning, osmosis, you know, and progression and development that they wanted to be in much more. So we kind of split the difference on 2 to 3 days a week within reason. I think it depends. I mean, back to this point here, we can't now have just these synthetic constructs of personas. I think we have to kind of hyper-personalize the way that work is created and consumed by members of staff in the future. So I don't think this hybrid thing is simply a case of saying 2 days there for 3 days there. I think it's far more complicated than that, and it's literally right at the start of this process. I don't know, I get into these, I don't know about you, but when I sit at home, I'm missing the social life. I want to go in. When I'm in the office, I'm like, why don't I drag myself in and spend this fortune to sit in a train for an hour and a half, people coughing around me and stuff. I don't know about you, but I think we're going to keep an eye on this, haven't we?
I have never seen anyone with that many metrics, so if you don't know, no one knows.
Well, I think we're too early. We need more metrics, and we need to do some testing of this in real time to work out what is actually leading to an increase in well-being and performance overall. And we're too early in the process to say. Maybe I'll come back next year with a...
But it has massive implications for so many people, not just the workers, who owns property in city centres, where you live, how much you use cars, and the effect on climate change. It's a massive issue.
I think so. And if anything, one of the things I think beyond this is purely like an HR thing or a well-being or leadership thing, to your point, is, you know, if we're now connecting things like diversity and inclusion, ESG, net zero to things like executive compensation, why are we not linking workforce well-being to this? We're already seeing this kind of institutional investor pushback on certain IPOs in tech investments recently because of the way that there's a perception that the workforce's wellness is not built into the deal. This could become one of the metrics we now are starting to have to display and maybe audit going forward. So people that say this is the end of the auditor, then got another thing coming.
Really good questions, by the way. Rob, on that note of working from home, there's quite a lot of talk at the moment in the US of there being some kind of like spy cameras put onto computers, people being able to watch what you do at home, track how many hours actual work you're doing. Is that something that you see a part of the future of hybrid working, or is that like a scary story that's not real, it's not going to happen?
Well, no, it's already happening. There was this immediate reaction at the start of the pandemic, in particular in organizations where there was an inherent lack of trust between management and employee that saw, I think, a race towards this sort of technology being deployed. And we've seen some pretty negative applications of this. You look at any survey, and I'm sure you've done many at Ulster, you know that the workers hate this. And if you've got people that are intrinsically negative about technology being deployed at them, they will find a way of gaming it. They'll work around it, and they'll leave. And I think for me, any technology that's got the workforce productivity performance in mind has to be done in coordination with them. And I think you've got profound ethics and privacy considerations to get right before you start dabbling in this area. So I think we'll start seeing a pushback against that, and it'll be far more focused on this type of approach, where it's in their interests as well as management's at the same time.
Yeah, and obviously a bad employee working in the office is surely going to be a bad employee working at home. That's right. You don't need spying in both locations. So my next question, and then I'll come back to the audience on this, is to do with bias in AI. And obviously as a director of AI, I'm sure that's a consideration. You mentioned obviously treating every employee equally in terms of how you track that data and what it means. How early do you consider the ethics of AI, obviously when you're building the technology that might obviously impact on someone?
So we as I mentioned before, build that in right from the start. Far too many of the stories you hear about AI having gone wrong, having led to discrimination, having led to reputational harm, is where it's done after the event. It's sort of retrofitted in at the end. Oh, we should have some ethics stuff at the end. You've got to design this with ethics in mind. You've got to go way beyond purely compliance, way beyond regulatory compliance sort of minimum criteria, and actually start looking at unintended consequences, looking at all those externalities, and try to ameliorate them at the start. If you're trying to do it at the end, it's too late. And I think for me, we're not going to answer all of them, but you can profoundly mitigate risk by having that thinking in at the start. And this is back to Blair's point, you know, that, and you probably see this in the academic world now, the need to bring together different disciplines is now not just a nice to have, this is essential to get right, yeah?
Any other questions?
Gentleman there over there.
Okay, yep. Here he goes, Annika Rice, hang on. Sorry.
It's so much easier to keep your hand up on Teams. So around the productivity metrics, I mean, there's good input metrics, but what were PwC looking at in terms of the benefits, you know, tangibly coming out of it?
Yeah, this is a problem, isn't it? Because what is productivity? You know, is it you know, a kind of secondary effect of profit growth or whatever it might be? I mean, we have one particular feature in our workforce around things like timesheets. So we do have that metric in mind, of course, that you can say that that's led to increased chargeability, possibly. I do worry that that's a bit sort of two-dimensional, though. So I think you're looking at overall performance uplift across the organization, and now we have this quantifiable way of measuring well-being. This is really critical now, because up until this moment in time, you ask any 10 people what well-being is, you get 10 different answers. Is it like absenteeism, presenteeism? Is it health impact on the workforce? Is it A, B, and C? Is it mental health? We're now able to actually quantify it. If we can measure it and quantify it, we can actually see how it's tracking and look at the patterns and do something about it. So I think it's how do you bring overall business performance together with overall workforce well-being, and then make sure the two are inextricably linked together.
Another question?
Hi, just on the back of Mark's question, a really interesting presentation. Thank you very much. The 1,000 people, you had 1,000 people over a 2-year period. You know, if you take those individuals at the end of the 2-year period, did they feel benefits? Was there a reduction in absenteeism? Was there?
I think
mental health issues.
Yeah. So the actual thing ran for several months last year, the 1,000-person program. Because we were kind of doing the tech after the event, we weren't seeing the real-time effects. The next version of this is going to be in real time. We've got quite a lot of anecdotal information, including the chairman himself. I managed to find myself in the Financial Times with him last month, talking about how he's very much changed his way of life according to what he's learned from the app. So I think we're seeing some anecdotal benefits coming through. It's this next iteration we'll start seeing really scaled benefits of how it's pulled through in terms of attrition, retention, and other sort of well-being outputs as well. But this is why I'm hoping I get invited back next year.
Okay, any other questions? If not, I'll ask one.
Go on in.
This is like mastermind, isn't it? So my next question is there any industries where AI is not being applied? And obviously, how much of a disruption can AI still make in different industries? I'm thinking there's no fuel crisis, but I bloody hope that AI would be able to tell people where there's petrol.
Well, the only one I've heard that is currently limited on its AI adoption is hairdressing. With respect, might not be a big problem, but
that was a big.
No, seriously, that's the one. Although Amazon have, I think, a site in London where you can go in and you can design your hair and get a haircut according to what their technology says. No, I mean, I think you'd say over the last 5 years, clearly banking, financial services have been racing ahead. But I would say in the last year or two in particular, you've seen amazing step change happening across the board in retail. I mean, we heard the colleague from McDonald's this morning. What they've achieved in the last year is extraordinary, you know, with the threat to their business model as well. So, no, I think every sector's now starting to dabble with this now. And clearly the price point has come down. Far more of these tools are available in the cloud. The skills required to access them now with low code and no code is increasingly more accessible. So I think many people now can get busy with trying to see if this can lead to benefits way more than they could 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay, so last question for me, and then I'll open it up again to the audience if anyone else has any questions. PwC, always recruiting, going through processes in Northern Ireland of recruiting, always. How do you use AI to better find staff that are inaccessible at the moment?
I mean, I'm asked about this so often, and
sorry.
Yeah, no, it's great. I don't think I've got a great answer yet because, unfortunately, there's been some poor stories of the way this has happened in other places in the past. You know, there's been bad training data that's led to discriminatory outcomes in hiring practices. We've seen some fairly iffy uses of facial recognition to look at things like micro-expressions and gestures to discern a good cultural fit for an organization, which is probably weak on the science. On the flip side, though, and you know, the sheer scale of hiring that we go through to hire our 2,000 grads a year, we will see well over 100,000 people. And we've got a team of people sitting here and in Birmingham pressing reject 100,000 times a year. And that system, that process has to be, you know, weak on things like cognitive dissonance, on unconscious bias. So I still maintain that there's fantastic promise to create more equity, to level the playing field, to be more creative in how you draw talent out, and to make the whole thing fairer and more efficient. But we don't walk in blind. You have to have those practitioners in the room asking the questions. Have you thought about this? What happens if that happens? And this is back to this point I keep coming back to time and time again, why a technology team is not staffed solely with technologists. And I think for me, and this is a great opportunity. You know, we've now got people with all different walks of life and outlooks that can come at things from a different angle and ask the hard questions. And you create better technology and outcomes because of that.
And that goes back to the ethics point at the very beginning, doesn't it? Because if you've got one data set or one type of people building that tech, then surely the outcomes are going to be biased towards that group.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beyond dispute now. We've seen that time immemorial, and that's beyond dispute.
And that's why we need to look at different types of people from different industries to come in to organisations. That's fair as well.
Exactly right. And you know, we know here that Northern Ireland won't achieve its growth aims and ability to cement its growing prestige in the technology field unless we can bring far more people in. I don't know how many more people we need to hire in Northern Ireland alone, but if you max that across, there's more stories about ASOS yesterday. There's not enough people from traditional walks of life coming into technology. We have to find a way of unlocking that by demonstrating they can play a profoundly useful part of the equation. And that's the exciting bit. You know, we just need to sell it better and explain how valuable this could be.
Okay, last question from the audience. Has anyone got a question they'd like to ask?
I think we've exhausted them prior to lunch.
Rob, I'm so sorry. I wanted to keep you on stage because you're only here... How long are you in Belfast for?
About an hour and a half more.
1 hour and a half longer. So big, massive round of applause to Rob. Thank you ever so much.